Let's get this party started. My name's Nat, and I am the head of community at Exceptional Individuals. We support neurodivergent individuals thrive in the workplace. We also work with organizations to help them become more informed. And every Thursday, unless I'm spending a day with the rhinos, why I wasn't there last week, we do these webinars. So to give some context, I'm neurodivergent and expert via experience. I'm also doing my master's in neuroscience, and I support people who are ND every single day. So you're in good hands, fingers crossed. But do know I am not a doctor, so if you do have any medical questions or want to make informed decisions, please go see your GP. Traditionally, we focus on dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, and ADHD. Today, we're going down a different route. Is there a link between neurodivergence and schizophrenia? Well, with most things, you are more prevalent. It's not exactly what you'd call a neurodivergence because it falls more into mental health realms. But when you look at things like ADHD, which is heavily influenced by dopamine, you'll realize that really the difference isn't big. And I think this is why it's quite interesting to dive in deep. Schizophrenia, dopamine v glutamate. Now, dopamine and glutamate are neurotransmitters. These are chemicals in the brain which sends messages around. They have different functions. Traditionally, most people have been looking at dopamine as called for the dopamine theory of schizophrenia. But there is emerging research and evidence around the glutamate one. If you're still like, I have no idea what you're talking about, Nat, don't worry, hold on tight. I'm going to hopefully be explaining it as much as I possibly can. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, schizophrenia is a serious mental disorder that causes detachment from reality. It affects thoughts, emotions, and behavior. It affects your kind of reality. Now, this can be from adding things to your reality or taking things away. It can affect you in very different ways. It's really interesting as well how it affects you at different times through your age. But I'm not going to give too much more away because I am going to be asking more questions around schizophrenia to begin with. If you're still like, I know schizophrenia is not great, but I don't really know what it is, well, maybe this will help you understand what's happening underneath the hood. Well, the reason why it's a mystery is truthfully, we do not know. There's a lot of theories, hypotheses, questions, but so much still to learn. And it is an area which is still growing. By all means, some of the things I'm saying today very well may be out of date in a few years' time, and hopefully because our knowledge is still expanding and growing. Here is some quick kind of true or false, just to kind of get a feel of the room. Is it true or false that schizophrenia is a physical illness? Is it true that it affects about 1 in 100 people? Does schizophrenia predominantly develop in old age? Does it have positive and negative symptoms, or just positive or just negative? And hallucinations, would they be considered a positive symptom or a negative symptom? All right, let's see what you'll put. Okay, false, true, true. So it is a mental condition, which just means what's happening is internal rather than external. It's never that black and white, is there? Of course, there are physical elements to it, but predominantly it is not. It does affect about 1 in 100, which is really, really common. Autism and ADHD is about 1 in 100. Schizophrenia is really common, yet nobody talks about it because it's still considered taboo and scary, when actually we need to talk about it more. So very, very common. Now, does it develop in old age? Well, yeah, but also it develops in young age. Predominantly, it develops in adolescence, that period where you kind of go through puberty and become an adult. That's when people are most susceptible. You can have it at any age, but it's the early ages where you really got to keep a strong eye out for. Positive symptoms, yeah. Are we talking about, like, what is a positive symptom? Does it mean great stuff? Yay, positivity. No, unfortunately not. It just means something which is added to what you already have. For instance, if you are hallucinating, that is a symptom that you didn't have previously, it is positive. If, however, you are normally quite motivated and suddenly you are no longer motivated, that is a negative symptom because it is taking away something that you already have. It is a mixed bag. I remember when I first heard it, I was like, well, is positive good? No, in this context, it just means it with or without, or taken away. Some positive symptoms are as follows. We've got hallucinations. This is when you kind of get detached from reality and you see things that are not there. This is when you believe things which are not true, or you would normally know not to be true, but now you're like, maybe they are. Other positive ones is unusual speech patterns. You can also get your words muddled up. And you'll see there's a lot of overlap with some of the neurodivergences. Atypical body movements. We often talk about stimming with autism, how you move around. This can also impact. Remember how we said it's not a physical disorder, but there are physical elements to it. Lastly, though there are more, is disordered thinking. Really struggling to get your thoughts in order. Things kind of going non-linear. You can see these are all things which, if you didn't have schizophrenia, you wouldn't experience. But with schizophrenia, it's kind of making that add-on. My first question, and we are going to be focusing a bit more on positive symptoms today than negative. My first question is, what is dopamine? Today's session is heavily inspired by our favorite dopamine. I was going to give you the answer there. Now, tell me, to your level of understanding, what is dopamine? What's the purpose of it? Yes, it is a neurotransmitter. It is a chemical messenger, absolutely. What about, do we know exactly what its role is? Hormone, chemical, reward? Well, it is actually known as the reward chemical, but that is probably an oversimplification of it because it can actually do many things. Chemical messenger, chemical, yeah, I'd say most of you get it. Yeah, it helps with motivation. Now, do feel good? Well, while those are all true, do know that it does more than that. And I think sometimes we oversimplify this chemical, and that can kind of muddy up our understanding of it. But essentially, in our brains, we have two things. We've got electrical signals and chemical signals, and those two together make our body, brains, and everything works. We've got our neuro pathways in our brain, kind of the cables. They are kind of electric, and at the end of the electric, to the other end of the electric, there are chemicals go in between, and it's in between that little gap, which is neurotransmitters. So different types of food, exercise, experiences can help produce or release these chemicals. And dopamine is a very kind of classic one, particularly with ADHD, but obviously for all of us. Now, if we want to get real nerdy now, which one of these symbols is dopamine? These are what scientists use in order to illustrate what dopamine is, because dopamine is so tiny, I don't know no one really knows what it looks like. Well, not in terms of which we actually understand. Oh, interesting. It is the middle one. Yeah. You'll see a lot of people who have all dopamine tattoos and stuff because it's normally a cheeky way of, you see it, right? It's normally a cheeky way of saying hey, I got ADHD, got schizophrenia. It's just a way of showing it. And these just tell you essentially kind of what they're connected to and their chemical makeup. Is it involved in the following? Is it involved in motivation and reward? Is it involved in movement? What about your mood? What about your attention, your learning and your memory? And what about sleep and dreaming? These are all potential things that may or may not be involved by dopamine. Remember, it's more than just feeling good. It's actually a really, really essential piece of chemical. It is true. It does all of these things. Without dopamine, we'd struggle to regulate our mood. It even helps with our movement, reward system, sleeping, memory, attention. It's important. Dopamine acts as a messenger between the brain and the nervous system to help the brain regulate and coordinate movement. So if you want to do anything in your body, dopamine is part of the messenger. Think of it kind of like BT. You need them to kind of make the phones work. Without them, you've just got cables. It's a chemical that does make us feel good. Yeah, it really does affect sleep as well. So what do you think, moving aside from dopamine for a moment, is the biggest cause of schizophrenia? Bear in mind, more research is needed. Just rank these up and down in terms of which ones you think is the biggest link. Is it genetics, which is your DNA, kind of what makes you you? Is it your brain structure, how your cables are all wired and interconnected? Is it complications during pregnancy and birth? Or is it the environmental factors? Pollution, environment, people being mean to you when you're younger? Okay, interesting. Now, bear in mind, everyone gets their stats and facts from other places, which is still ongoing. But yes, genetics plays a big role. I would probably say genetics and environmental factors, because you'll normally notice that a lot of people have the likelihood of getting schizophrenia due to their genetics, but it is more related to the environmental factors which can trigger. So you'll notice this is why adolescence, when you're going through a lot of changes, you're more susceptible. For instance, if you take, say, marijuana at a young age, your brain is still developing. And that's why it can be more dangerous than, say, in adulthood. But yeah, all of these have a part to play, but as to how much of a part, we'll see. Now let's have a little look at some negative symptoms. Remember, negativity is taking away from what you already have. So no longer being interested in day-to-day activities. We're not talking necessarily like kind of suicidal, but just what you are normally okay with, you're no longer okay with. It might mean that you become a little bit like emotionally dulled. You struggle to show happiness, excitement, even sadness. It can make you a bit more kind of neutral. Antisocial, again, don't enjoy going out. This kind of relates to losing interest in what things you used to do. Planning troubles, and low energy. And this is the game when I always tell people, when we talk about things like ADHD, we always think it's about having excess energy, not necessarily. It's how it kind of the distribution. And you can have really low periods. I'm going to obviously keep referring back to neurodivergence because see, that's my specialism. But again, they are different from schizophrenia. Now, let's have a little look at dopamine and schizophrenia. We'll be doing glutamate later. Forget about it for now. How do these two interlink? Let's see. First of all, do you think dopamine is key in understanding schizophrenia? Yes or no? Is it the kind of the missing piece of the puzzle? And this is a question. Obviously, you think, oh, obviously, but no, because this is just being our ongoing key area of interest. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one. And this is why we're talking between the two neurotransmitters today. The research looks promising, but it's not conclusive. What are the links? Well, dopamine if you have high levels of dopamine, there is a strong link to schizophrenia. Symptoms. More dopamine causes hallucinations and delusions. So we know, okay, more dopamine, more likely, more dopamine, potentially more hallucinations. The reward systems, dopamine issues affect motivation. We know more dopamine makes you feel good and happy, which is a reward, but too much of it kind of stops you from being motivated. It's a bit like if you're working towards a prize, you'll work really hard for that motivation. But if you have loads of those prizes, who cares anymore? I'm not motivated. Medication. We've known that drugs that actually block dopamine can ease symptoms. If there's too much dopamine, we maybe get schizophrenia. If we block some of that dopamine, maybe less symptoms. You can see there's a clear link here. Louise says, my son was diagnosed as having ADHD and autism before schizophrenia. I mean, that's interesting as well. Depends obviously like ages, because again, schizophrenia it's not normally in childhood. It's normally as you're kind of making that transition. Right here, this looks like it's a clear-cut case, right? Clearly, it is dopamine, which is the reason for schizophrenia. But as we say, there's more to the story. On here, I want you to know the side effects of antipsychotics. We talked about why antipsychotics, which essentially kind of block all that dopamine, like, whoa, you stop dopamine, sounds a good thing. It controls the symptoms, right? There are side effects. All medication has side effects. For instance, we've got drowsiness. Having some of these antipsychotic medications, which can block dopamine, can make you really drowsy. Maybe that's okay for you. If you're doing like, say, a factory job with like heavy machinery, maybe not. Weight gain. Some people won't matter. For other people, that could really affect their self-esteem. Dry mouth sucks, but maybe I guess that's manageable. Poor concentration. That's probably a deal breaker for me. Restless, not great. Tremors when you're kind of moving, also not great. And again, there's another link between dopamine and things like Parkinson's disease. That chemical, we can't live with it, can't live without it. Let's see. Most of you, weight gain is unacceptable. And I know that it's really depressing. Like, my mum has, a condition similar to schizophrenia, and her medication has made her put on a lot of weight. Now, she hates it. It makes her really, really depressed. But on the other hand, it keeps her mind stable. And I think for her, the mind is more important than the body, but that's not undermining the effect that the body has on everything. Drowsiness, I think it depends on what you do in life. Like, I take hay fever medication. That makes me a tiny bit drowsy. Dry mouth, yep. My antidepressants give me dry mouth, is what it is. But the other ones, they aren't great. It's really kind of a pros and cons. It's very, very independent. Yeah, Gregory, they all do depend on how severe. Now, in terms of how do we know about this stuff? Well, we use some fancy gadgets and gizmos. Have you heard any of these? Have you heard of a PET scan, a SPECT scan, or an fMRI? These are all different types of things that we use in order to look under the hood. Because I'm talking about some stuff today, but how do we even know this is even true? Some of you may have even had some of these scans, and they work in slightly different ways, and some of them are cheap and easy, but poor resolution. Others are super HD, but might give you a slight bit of radiation. You kind of have to weigh up the pros and cons. Now, this is an image which shows a schizophrenia patient. Have a guess at which image is the one who has schizophrenia and the one that does not have schizophrenia. To give you color coding, the regions of the brain include yellow for the outer part, white for decision making, black for senses and memory, and red for emotions, in terms of the amount of activation. So all of you, two of you, yes, have gone for the one with darker colors, the one with lighter colors. Let's see. It is the one with more activation. And this is because, again, an increase in dopamine would mean the brain is more active. And the other one is kind of just doing what it should be doing. But again, you really do need to be quite an expert because they don't look that different, do they? But a slight difference can make it. As you can see, they use different kind of color temperatures. Obviously, in the brain, it's not in color. We add those colors afterwards in order to help us understand. Now, another thing that's worth noting is that schizophrenia changes. The most important time when it comes to schizophrenia is in the very early stages. This is why it is literally paramount to get tested early. If you wait until later adulthood and you've already got schizophrenia, yeah, you kind of got it now, but you can dramatically minimize the kind of negative consequences if you do it in early stages. Some of the things that you might want to look out for include nervousness, shaking, kind of struggling to stay cool, restlessness, having depression, the anxiety, and the trouble concentrating. And we've already said why. It's too much dopamine which causes all of these. Now, we are all sometimes nervous. We are always a little bit depressed sometimes, always a bit anxious. These things are normal. But if they happen consistently and to a level which interferes with your day-to-day life, that's when you might have some challenges. Please don't start thinking, oh my God, I was a bit restless this morning. It is not that. Now, a good question is, why are we even bothering studying these early signs of schizophrenia? Like, when I say early signs, we're talking before someone would be even diagnosed, before they would officially consider to have schizophrenia. Is there a big benefit to studying it before it's happened, or is there a bigger benefit in studying it when it's fully emerged in someone? No idea. I love the honesty. Prevention is better than cure. Yeah, that is definitely true. With most things, like, again, once something has fully set, you can't do much about it. But when it is still setting, there's room for work. I kind of look at it a bit like with cement or clay or pottery or paint. When it's fresh, you can move it, you can sculpt it, you can do things with it. But once it has hardened and set, that is how it is for life. So in the early stages, this is when we can pick up on the minute differences. You can watch something grow. You can see how quickly it progresses, yes, and what makes it progress and what doesn't. Remember, it's not as simple as just genetics or just environmental. To get diagnosed and to get help earlier, yes, that is a really big one. Slow the progression, absolutely. Better identification, yes. Create more coping strategies. We've got a mixture here of kind of soft ones and more kind of proactive ones, depending on what you might want to do. Most people don't get treated or don't get seen and in the right time, and sadly, that's the truth. All right, here is the crucial parts to understanding the early development. And let's go through it. We've got pre-morbid. This is before there's anything. The sooner you get help, the better you are of staying well. This is when you might have one or two characteristics. Then, as you kind of get a little bit older, we've got the critical period. And this is where you act now or forever hold your peace. It is crucial on the correct medication as soon as possible. If you're on the right medication, it can block some of that dopamine and your body can keep developing at the right pace. If that dopamine isn't controlled, potentially, remember this is a theory, if the dopamine isn't controlled, then it kind of floods the systems and kind of damages your inner circuitry. And then once it's damaged, it's damaged. Then once you've had it, there's a stabilization phase. So continued treatment is crucial in getting well and preventing relapse. Once your body has kind of evened out, balanced itself, you should be able to live a perfectly happy, controlled life. Doesn't mean that you still don't have schizophrenia, but it's not going to be impacting you on how it could. However, if you aren't taking it, you'll see how it's a bit of a downward slope and you kind of digress quite dramatically and then you stay pretty consistently low. So with the right medication, symptoms of schizophrenia can be managed to prevent a negative impact on your life, allowing you to live the best way you had before. So it doesn't get rid of schizophrenia, it controls it. And this is, I think, quite a good diagram because it really does show you the essentialness of getting support early on. It either goes from controlling symptoms or not being able to control. And the longer you wait during this critical process period, the harder it will be to control them in the long run. So the key takeaways when we're coming to dopamine is excess dopamine can trigger positive symptoms like hallucination. Dopamine is that one for positivity, positive symptoms. That is what we're looking for. Not talking about negative symptoms, positive. Dopamine deficiencies can lead to negative symptoms. So too much dopamine, positive symptoms. A lack of dopamine, negative symptoms. It really is the Goldilocks and the Three Bears thing where you want just the right amount. If you take too much medication and it blocks too much dopamine, you're still going to have a bad time. And also to know that this goes way beyond dopamine. It would be too simple just to blame it on one thing. Schizophrenia involves more than dopamine. This is also affected by your genetics, your environment, and your brain chemicals. So let's not give dopamine a hard time. It's just part of the puzzle. And medication really can support. It can target dopamine, it can address positive symptoms, but not all aspects. So for instance, while these drugs might limit the positive symptoms like hallucinations, they do not support all the aspects, such as the negative symptoms. It's not a miracle cure. This is why people may still be struggling with certain elements, even though they're on medication. I appreciate this is some heavy stuff. Nice. Now let's go even further down the rabbit hole to glutamate. Now, worth noting, this theory is a little bit more controversial. Less people support it, but there is more research going into it. This is very much a kind of newer theory. But the dopamine theory isn't perfect. It just doesn't answer all of our questions. So the likelihood is it's probably not simply one or the other. It's probably a mixture and maybe some even areas we haven't focused on. Please take whatever I say today with a grain of salt because it is still an ongoing story. We're going to be looking at glutamate's role in schizophrenia. We're going to be how to even measure how much glutamate is in the old brain and also the types of treatment. So first question, what is glutamate? We know that glutamate is vital for brain functioning, influencing our neurotransmitters, but what is it? Now, I did just show it a minute ago, but let's see if you can remember or guess which one is the chemical symbol or compound for glutamate. I think, consider glutamate as a very kind of collaborative neurotransmitter. It works well with others. Some are very isolated. This one will kind of interact. Yes, it is number 2. Well done, all. And this will give us an idea. Let's have a little bit look. We know that glutamate is a very collaborative one. We know that it also supports brain functions, but we also know it is different to dopamine. But again, they can work. Now, this is quite a good image that shows you. For instance, this is a synapse, which is in your brain. You've kind of got your the parts of the brain that sends the information. Then you got your synapse, and you see in these little kind of dots are your glutamate. Now, you can have many different types of chemicals on here, but when the brain gets kind of a bit of electricity, which is saying, okay, maybe move your arm, it will pop them out. They'll float into the ether, and then they'll get retaken up by receptors. And sometimes you get too many of these and it's overloaded. You can get too little of them and there's not enough impact, or they can disappear, they can get resucked up, they can not get absorbed. There are so many different things that can happen when your body is accepting or not accepting these chemicals. So the quick overview is schizophrenia is a burden on patients and society, hence why we want to ideally not have it be a thing. It normally involves abnormalities in glutamate. How we expect glutamate to work in the body doesn't work the exact same in schizophrenia. We know that there is a connection. We understand glutamate. Understanding glutamate will help new treatments. Because remember, when we block dopamine, it only solves part of the problem. It is still a whole other section which isn't being supported, which tells us there's more to the story. Let's say we've got some dopamine here. Again, when the dopamine kind of connects to our channel or receptors, think of it kind of like a key. It kind of goes in, it unlocks it, then it kind of opens up the gates. And that's when other neurotransmitters can go in. It's very collaborative. It's essentially the gatekeeper. It opens up what goes in and what not. And too much of it, it stays open for too long. Not enough of it, it doesn't open at all. It really is an important part of our brain chemistry. Here's a nice image. It's worth noting that glutamate can, on average, affects about 20 plus receptors. We have lots of little receptors, and these are the things which kind of allow chemicals to go from one cell to the other. And it's complex because glutamate can react with over 20 different types. Finding out exactly which one is the problem one, you can see being really, really difficult. They're in these little pockets, and then they kind of get chucked out, and then you'll see that some of them go nowhere, others of them kind of go on the receptors, and some don't. And you'll see the other colors are different types of neurotransmitters. And glutamate will essentially make it the others can be taken. But it's a complicated old process. And this is why knowing the exact cause or what is just happening is process of elimination, to put it mildly. But what does too much glutamate actually do? Now, we know what too much dopamine does, but what about too much? Let's do a little spinny wheel and see where it lands. It damages the neurons. The neurons are the cells that talk to each other. Too much of glutamate, we've damaged it. I like to look at this where you've kind of got your circuitry. A little bit of rain probably isn't going to hurt your circuits. A complete flood is going to completely frazzle them, and you're going to ruin all your electronics. So yeah, we do not want to do that, because while neurons can regrow, it's not quick. They're really, really slow. And even that is contended. Cells firing too quick. You remember how we said, essentially you got your cell, then the chemical goes across into the next one, and then it fires and says, all right, do that. If it's firing too quick, you're going to have bad results. How he talked about positive symptoms such as like tremors, well, that is when there's too much firing and it's going quicker than it would like, or anxiety. These are things that we obviously want to avoid. And we've also got, we've had that one. We've also got cell death. In our brain, we've got loads of cells and they naturally die. It's called cell pruning. But if they're getting killed off too quick, it's not great. Think of it like a plant. Sometimes branches will die off. That's okay. That's natural. But when too many die off, they don't grow back. So we know that dopamine, it's such a tongue twister. glutamate is important. Now, taking a bit of a detour, just because I think it's quite interesting, we're looking at PCP, and this is on the streets known as angel dust. And it's interesting because this, I'm not saying you try it, but just know it kind of mimics it quite well. I want you to do a little pin what you think they have in common. These are the things that taking angel dust will kind of give you. And you'll notice that a lot of these overlap with schizophrenia. Maybe not much with this side, but for instance, amnesia, confusion, euphoria, anxiety, and even some of the below. But it's this section. And again, that's really interesting. Why? Because if we can understand how this drug works, we can also understand how schizophrenia works, and also the relationship between dopamine and glutamate. Okay, that's a lot of complicated words back and forth. But let's look at some research, because again, this is still really early days with understanding glutamate. This is why it's not kind of the standard one we talk about. There's this fluid in the brain, and apparently Kornhuber, that's the name, said that they found lower brain fluid, glutamate, but subsequent tested show no changes. And this is another thing. In the brain, we've got like kind of liquid, which is needed in the brain, I guess, to keep it lubricated. And in some tests, they found that those with schizophrenia had less of this fluid, which had glutamate in. So that's interesting. But then other studies didn't find anything. So you can see why this is a bit contested, because some say some things, some say other things. Just to give you an idea why when we say something is contested and it's not unanimously agreed upon, it's because not all results kind of match up with each other. And there could be so many reasons why that is. But how do you reckon we might measure glutamate? Now, could it be MRS, PET? And you might have never heard of MRS. It's a different variety of MRI. So MRI does images particles, where MRS examines tissue chemicals. Sounds similar, but they are different. I just didn't want to give you the wrong information. So let's have a look at MRS, measuring like the tissue. When we want to have a little look at glutamate, the body doesn't fully reflect brain functions. We don't get all the information. But if we're just looking purely at the body, we're not going to get all the information. Neuroimaging, however, can gauge brain glutamate levels. So if we look at the body, when someone has quite severe schizophrenia later down the line, it's quite visibly obvious. But if we're really interested in the early pre-schizophrenia stages, this is when we've got to look in the brain. And taking these brain images, we'll be able to see how much glutamate is in there, what it's affecting, what activities, what thought processes are activating it or not activating it. And it can be far more accurate. It's not perfect, but you can see, again, these little images, they show you different types of brain scans, show you different types of information. This is why doing multiple ones can be beneficial. But which one is better? Is it PET scan or MRS? And you'll see the images here. They show you kind of different varieties. Is it possible to have the slides afterwards? Well, Louise, we are recording today, so you will be able to see it afterwards. If you want the slides, drop me an email, but normally I do it via just recorded video. The answer is arguably PET, but when the real answer comes down to understanding what it's used for. You'll notice that one of them is higher resolution, but the other one is better at showing activation. It's the right one for the right cause. Okay, now the key takeaways when it comes to the schizophrenia and dopamine is schizophrenia likely is not simply due to dopamine or glutamate. Likely it is a combination of both, and the exact cause is still unknown, but we definitely know that we're onto something here. We're not quite there, but we're onto something. We know that too much dopamine can equal positive symptoms. Too much affects more your cognition, processing, and negative symptoms. So just know that they do different things. This is why if you take one medication, which is predominantly focused around dopamine, it will have some impact. but not all impact. And this is why different medications work for different people. We also know that new drugs are now starting to target glutamate, where traditionally it's only focused on dopamine. If you are going to your GP, definitely ask them, be curious. This medication, is it predominantly going to affect the positive symptoms or the negative symptoms? And now you'll know a little bit more about it. We know that having less glutamate will affect brain development. Again, really essential in those early stages in adolescence. And maybe we've mainly looked at adults, and maybe that's why we haven't focused as much on glutamate. Would treating both counteracts each other? Well, it's a good question. Potentially, it depends on how good the medication is, because when we talk about receptors, they can kind of have negative consequences. We talked about the side effects and how much of a bad side effect can we accept before it becomes worse than the thing we're trying to treat. Good question. I don't know the complete answer to that. I think normally it comes down to managing the side effects, because you can only do so much at one time. But good question. But what we do know is that by understanding this better, we are going to get these better interventions, and we are still a long way off for truly knowing. If any of you found today interesting and want to learn more, yes, Amy, well, you knew what I was going to say. We do other presentations every Thursday. The next one, we're looking at the blueprint of autism, and this is going to be really interesting. So what is autism? We've spoken about the origins of schizophrenia today, but what about autism? And this is cutting edge research because we're still ongoing. Is it more to do with environmental factors, or is it more genetics, or is it both? And if it's both, is there a point when you have no autism to now you have autism? Is it something which early intervention means you can avoid? Is it something which is due to in your embryonic stages? Do check it out. Oh, I'd like to talk to my son's psychiatrist about this. Well, I'm glad. Talk to him is definitely what I'd recommend. Again, not a doctor. Thanks much. This made me more interested about schizophrenia. I'm glad, Jane. It's really, really common. But I think it's more taboo than, say, neurodivergence. I would love it if we can open up the conversation and make it more accessible. If you do want to watch this recording or want to watch other recordings, do go to our YouTube channel. Again, like and subscribe, and you can learn loads of things. We do the science of ADHD, schizophrenia. We kind of really break things down, complex subjects in really digestible things. I'm going to try to attend your workshops. Yes, Louise, please do. We'd love to have you. And I hope you have a great rest of your Thursdays. Thank you everyone for attending.